Hey, this is Kev from Wonderland. I'm back. We were just talking about the wind and how it affects the morphological characters of the flowers, part of your selection process. So we covered outdoor pretty good. And when the only thing we didn't talk about really was sifting process in terms of your biology. What are you using for your base? And what you're going to find is that the input that you use in terms of your feed and media selection, quality of water, has a massive input on the plant, period. And that's what we would call phenotype, the environmental influence on the genotype. So the gene is the gene. What's the environment doing to the gene? Part of that environment is what you're putting into it, your inputs. And so what I noticed years ago was when I was judging the EC for Tim, the Emerald Cup, I started picking out, because I always keep notebooks of all the stuff. So it lets me kind of go backwards when I'm done and look at the outliers, and then I can go back and find what the grower actually did so I can quantify why I saw what I saw. So I started to find a lot of these cannabis strains that we were consuming had this really neat, sweet taste. Developed, rich. It was unique. I was like, whoa, what is this? And I started picking it up in a couple here or there, and I just noted it. And when it was all done, I went back over all those, and they all used the same compost mix out of Sonoma that used grape waste. So it had grape waste in it, like the husks, the skin of the grape. And it added this really neat, sweet flavor that complemented the varietals they had been growing. So it doesn't mean that would make everything taste good. But for the varieties that they were entering in, it did. It enhanced the flavor profile. Guano was a good example too. Back in the day when you were in Humboldt County, everything had a guano flavor to it, which has this really rich sweetness. I mean, unmistakable. And you don't see it anymore, and I'm glad we don't, because we basically don't mine the caves like we used to. I mean, we just friggin' wiped them out. So I'm glad that we've switched out of using guano, and I don't use it anymore either, because I would rather have less quality cannabis than have no bats. So there's always a trade. But the point I'm making is that when you're doing the selection outside, recognize that your mix that you're using to build the delivery of foods and the quality of the water has a radical impact on that varietal. And so you just have to log all this. And once you log it, it allows others to be able to get your information and then utilize it for their location. And you just have to inventory this information, put it into some kind of file, hold it in your head, and it allows a repeatability so that when people really enjoyed this product and they just were in love with it, you're able to give other growers the ability to do this. And so much of the new world is, I love this word, proprietary. I invented it. Yeah. What I like is communal. I like sharing cannabis. And I like to share the information about how we produce it, how we use it, where we locate it. Because otherwise, it's to me, it's the opposite of cannabis. Cannabis was always best. It's just like life. Life is best shared. So cannabis should be shared like this, in my opinion. And it's only my opinion. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. But to me, and it's how I behave, I share the info. I share the goodies. I share the tech. And what it does, it allows many people to benefit from your work. And it allows people to be able to make these leapfrogs. They jump forward in terms of skill level, and the belief that all these individuals around you are your competitor is just not real. That's a manufactured reality. They should be your collaborators. They should be co-conspirators, and that allows all of us together as a huge group to be able to look at cannabis in a much different perspective, and allow the true outliers, the true wonderful varietals that we're seeking to come out. And the ability to be able to share that information is huge. So we covered a bunch of outdoor, and we'll shift into greenhouse. Greenhouse production is unique in the sense that you have a couple different ways of looking at it. You have greenhouse that's very simple, no supplemental lighting, very limited infrastructure, basically just plastic over a top. Usually that light depth is how we would look at that. Light depth, we're going to call it 3 primary seasons in light depth, where we have the early season, so starting in maybe April, Then we have a mid-season starting, say, June, July. Then we have a later season starting maybe, August, September. And each one of those depth cycles, depending on where you live, has specific requirements. Where the early depth, you have a cold, moist bottom. And so if you're not working with hydronics, under heating, boiler-driven heating so that your floors are heated or your benches are heated, then the soil temp's below 68 and you end up having a different uptake. And some plants don't like cold feet. They don't like to be in cold situations. Then you have plants that go through the middle depth and they're exposed to extremely high levels of heat when you box them during that hot part of the cycle. Some plants don't like that. The flower doesn't appear right. So when we talk about people having intersex issues, what people call hermaphroditism, but fundamentally it's where the female plant produces male sex organs. The early depth, that cold can stimulate it because the plant goes intersex, and as a survival pattern so that it can reproduce. It'll intersex in the middle cycle too, where it thinks it's too hot and that there's issues. And then the final cycle is where you have diminished light and cooler at night. Some plants don't like that either. And so when you're doing your most simple outside greenhouse light depth, you're really trying to differentiate what depth did it work on. And so for a lot of places that have very low infrastructure, very low facility development, choose 3 different varieties. So what you do is you develop one that works in that early. You'll find one that works in the middle. So the early is cold and wet. The middle is excessively hot. The last depth of a cycle would be where you have diminishing light, cooler temperatures. Not moist as much, but cooler. And so you would basically work with 3 different varietals. Then we get into regular greenhouses where we start having a lot of infrastructure. We start having control mechanisms. We start having hydronics, heating. If we have those, it allows us to standardize what we do through the season. Most of these are also going to be mixed light. They're going to have supplemental lighting used. Supplemental lighting makes a huge difference because the appearance of the flower is directly affected by that lighting tech. So when people were buying cannabis in the 70s, everything was outdoor from these other countries and sent over here. People had an idea what cannabis looked like. Cannabis then goes indoor, and it changes how it looks. And it changes how it looks because the plant is responding to the spectra that it's receiving. So morphologically, it starts to change appearance based off of what light we use. So when you're doing greenhouse work with diffuse sunlight, you're getting this beautiful amount of light and light information all over the greenhouse. But when we can run some supplementals with it, it allows the plant to take on more of an indoor appearance. And over the course of time, that'll be less of a concern because people will be aware of the realities that indoor and outdoor are really fundamentally just different looking. Some subtleties, but the desire for indoor flower was driven, I think, so much through magazines because you have an ability to sell products to indoor growers consistently. Once you start to get into outdoor and you build some soil, all you're doing is doing a soil analysis and a gentle top dress and some water. You're not really doing much. But indoor, technology constantly changing, new lights, new delivery systems, new methods of delivering the ingredients. All that is a never-ending array of consumerism. And so indoor was focused on because of illegalities. And then the magazines realized that they could sell a tremendous amount of products to people. And so everyone who got into cannabis growing for the last 20 years basically saw indoor flower in magazines, and that's what they wanted to repeat. And when they didn't see it look like that, they said something's wrong with it. And that's not really the truth, but until the market gets educated enough to understand this, it helps if it has a more indoor appearance. And the ability for supplemental lighting to help change that is huge. So these massive greenhouse operations using supplemental lights always have a different appearance than massive greenhouse operations that don't. Certain greenhouses have issues because they used to be called hothouses. So they were used to keep things warm in a season. Now you have greenhouses that are in the central part of California, they're in the southern part of California, they're in Arizona. Massive facilities, mega facilities. But they're working with ultra high heat levels and dry. So they're actually having to add humidity to these things to kind of balance out the structure in the facility. And what you'll find is plants that have to be selected for those applications. And so really depending on what it is you're selecting for, where you're selecting, and what's your ultimate purpose of it determines that criteria. Greenhouses have inherently higher humidity levels in moister areas and inherently higher temperature levels in hotter, drier areas. And so plants that were selected in northern greenhouses might not necessarily do so well in the southern greenhouses and vice versa. So the same thing, your sifting process, your selection process based off the specific. And if we have something that's a true outlier, it works in many of these locations. So that covers pretty much, we talked about indoor, we talked about the lighting, we talked about outdoor, we talked about proximity. We talked about all these factors over these last couple of videos. And it's really all about, remember, the whys. Why you're doing it. And if it's for commercial production, then we can utilize Burbank's large populations, sift for the outliers based off of numerics, based off of visuals, based off of resistance, based off of yield. And then from that population, pull the ones that we like for quality. But if you're in a quality market, it's the opposite. You go for quality first. And you take every one of the quality cultivars you can pull from these selection processes and you put that into a group. And then you pull it out. People want to be able to select in a day. And sometimes it happens. Sometimes you get a pack of 10 seeds and you'll find something that no one's ever found before. That was cheese. Cheese is a good example. The cheese was found in a pack of seeds. It was an old Skunk One. It's a throwback. It has this ungodly terp signature. It couldn't have been any nastier in how people perceived it. It was out of a regular pack of seeds. The white. I think the white's out of like a Northern Lights line. Same thing. It came out of a pack of seeds. And so it wasn't this massive sift that created it. It was out of a relatively small population. So it doesn't mean you need 100,000 seeds to find the killer. It just helps. And we always use the same analogy where if one was seeking a friend to hang out with, you might find him in a group of 3. You might find him or her in a group of 100, better selection. Out of 100,000, you ought to find somebody that lines up with you a little better in terms of your likes, dislikes, and and how you function. So large populations make a massive difference, but for most people, they don't have the ability to do them in that scope. And so that's why we talked about if you're running 100 plants as a regular grower, then you're able, and it's indoor, then you're able to run that, say 5-6 times a year. That allows you to look at 600 different plants if you wanted to. And if you were looking through a population over the course of a year, you'd be able to pull something out that was incredible. And when you're looking for incredible doesn't get less trendy. Everything we're working with is basically, landrace populations, which is the base of everything, and then skunk populations and OG populations, fuel populations. These are the major forms of almost all populations today in cannabis. And so what we find is humans don't flip-flop that much. They like things that they like, and they like subtle variations and little changes. But once you find something that's a high-quality selection in your hands, and it works for you, who cares if it works for anybody else? If you're trying to sell it, does the population like it? Why do they like it? Is it just because it's trendy, or because it's actually extremely satisfying? Those kind of criteria make a difference. And when you can find stuff that's very satisfying, that works for you, you end up having something that is well worth the time of spending a year, because you'd be able to use it for the next 5 to 10 years in terms of sellability. And if one looks at this process like this, then one realizes that it's not a waste of time to hunt, and that it's the hunting through the varietals, and it's the optimizing what you're doing and looking for the best intersection of all these things we talked about to work for the individual. So, like I said, almost all these videos are always based for the home user, smaller grower, because most commercial people are aware of a lot of this. But that's not the majority of the population. Those are the outliers. The majority of the population is regular people. And that's where we all started. Nobody was born on top. And so we hope that you got some quality out of this. And I'll give a plug over to the Growers Quest over on Greenflower. They just opened up their platform for free. So a tremendous amount of the video material they're shooting is going to be available to the general public. And I think that's awesome because they're putting out some really quality content. So I hope you enjoyed the series I just did today about selection process, sifting, and these different situations. Anybody got any questions, hit me up. But in the meantime, bam.